Now, the camping industry is a pretty incredible industry just in and of itself. How many here have grandchildren? I want you to imagine you take your most precious grandchild, and I know every one of you in this room would do anything for your grandchild. You'd give up anything. But for some strange reason, people entrust their grandchildren and their children to 18-year-olds for a week, complete strangers they don't know. It's one of the great phenomena. It's one of the great secrets that I really shouldn't be letting out on video here, but it's one of the great secrets that you're entrusting your most prized possession to a bunch of young people. But I will tell you something. If you could see what these young people are capable of, it would inspire you. The way they treat those children, the way they speak to them, the way they encourage them, the way they pour themselves in them and care for them to make sure they're safe is so inspiring. We recognized something was happening in our camp, and so we brought in an outsider and we asked, would you do some research and just help us understand what it is we're doing, because these young people that grow up through camp, they come as guests, they become staff, are now becoming leaders, and they always refer back to camp. They always refer back to their experience at Muskoka Woods as shaping them. Today, the chief planner of Toronto is one of our girls that grew up through camp, was on our staff, and she said that it was her time at camp where someone first recognized her as a leader. And so we did a research piece and we asked, what is it we do with young people? And I want to encourage you to take these three same things and practice them wherever you find yourself. Practice these three things with your grandchildren and with your own children. So when the research was done, the consultant came to us and said, there are several things you do, but three distinct things you do that shape a kid's life and young people's lives. You see them, you stretch them, and you support them. What's interesting, the Center for Creative Leadership, when they did research on leaders, and I'm sure many of you in business did some work with the Center for Creative Leadership, when they did their research and they looked at business leaders, and they said, what is it that forges leadership in the lives of business leaders, men and women? They said it's assessment, challenge, and support. Assessment is about seeing reality. Challenge is about stretching. And supporting is about supporting. And we find these same three attributes were what young people said, the reason I'm a leader today is because someone looked at me and they looked so deep, they saw who I really was, and they encouraged me. Then they stretched me. And there's nothing more stretching than being responsible for a real little child's life. It's the most real responsibility you'll be given. In fact, I often say to people, you'll never be given that level of responsibility, probably until you're in your 30s and you're given your first team in business. But for some reason, we give them 9 little children, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds under their care. And this is a stretching experience, but it does something. But then they said, in the midst of all the challenges and the stretching, an adult came along who could see them, stretch them, and then encourage them. So I just want to pick up on those 3 little things, that if we're going to shape a generation, whether it be through a camp or one of your grandchildren, it begins by seeing, stretching, and supporting. You know, Mr. Body was an incredible man. He could see other things that others missed. This past week, we had the police, the Metropolitan Police, up with a bunch of kids who were really struggling with life. And one of the police officers is Sean Cosgrove. Sean Cosgrove came up, and during sitting around the table with these young people from a very troubled neighborhood, they asked to tell stories and one of their favorite memories from camp. And Sean said that, listen guys, I want to tell you, before I was a police officer, I grew up here at Muskoka Woods. I was one of the local kids that lived close by, and I came here on weekends to work. And one particular day, I was in the kitchen, and we were goofing off. And we used to wear these hats, and I got a pair of furry ears, and I put them on, and I was running around the kitchen. As I came tearing through the kitchen, making everybody laugh, I ran right into Mr. Body. And Mr. Body looked at me, and Sean said, you know, Mr. Body was one of those men that you just stood the attention when he walked in the room, and I did as his son-in-law. I jumped to my feet. He was a man who commanded incredible presence. He carried an authority about him. And when he looked at this young guy running around with a hat and furry ears and running around a kitchen where you're not meant to run, he turned to him and he said, Sean, using his name, and spoke right into his heart. He could see beyond the fun and could see the young person. I wonder in your life who first saw you. I wonder who it is that first spotted you. I wonder who is the person that saw something in you and spoke a word to you that encouraged you to step out. I wonder who it is that first saw you. If there's anything we do in our camp, it is to see young people for who they are, these incredibly creative, brilliant young minds. It's amazing what happens when you see a young person. One of our cabins, suddenly stuff started going missing. And then in the next cabin, stuff started going missing. So finally, Chris Tompkins, who's our director of summer camp, he began to do what camp directors occasionally have to do, is look around and just see, why is there stuff going missing? And finally, he narrowed it down to one cabin. He went into the cabin, he got the boys together, and they were teenagers, and said, guys, there's a lot of stuff going missing. He said, I hate to do this, but we just need to sort of, be honest here and take a look in the bags and stuff. And people started to empty their bags, and Chris was feeling good that, didn't know who this was, but he looked on one particular bed. And there on this particular bed lay a little bag and a pillowcase. And Chris, with a sharp eye, saw the pillowcase didn't look like the kind of shape it should be when you put your head on your pillow. So finally, Chris looked at this young man and he just said, what's in there? Very sheepishly, this young man went over and he poured out, and sure enough, there was an iPod and a couple of passports from his counselors that were missing. The young man's head dropped, and Chris said, come with me. And as Chris turned, he looked at the young man, and there was just something about him he could see. But Chris noticed he had a tiny little bag, just a tiny little backpack. No suitcase, no nothing else, just a tiny little backpack with him. And as Chris went out, because he spotted that, and he just could sense in his heart, he could see that there was something not right, he said to the young man, how did you get to Muskoka Woods? And he said, I don't know. He said, somebody sent me here. He said, my dad is in prison. My dad was taken away. And he said, I got sent here. And he said, I just saw this stuff and I don't have this stuff. And he said, you're stalling because you're calling the police. And Chris said, well, let's go for a walk. And Chris walked him down. And friends, if you heard this little young man's story, this teenager's story, your heart would break. And then he kept saying, when's the police coming? Because I know that's what they do. They'll come for me and take me away. I'm going to be arrested. And Chris said, well, let's go back to your cabin. And the young man was nervous. And as he walked up, there was the counselor standing waiting. And Chris went up and said, this is your opportunity. And he went up to the counselor, who was from England. And he said to him, I need to say to you, I'm sorry I took your passport. And the counselor said, look, I forgive you. And the young man said, when's the police coming? And then they got back up, and there was another counselor who was next door. And when he got beside him, again, Chris said, here's your opportunity. He went up to the other counselor, and he said, listen, I took your stuff. I'm so sorry. I know I'm in a lot of trouble. And the counselor looked at him and said, look, listen, this can be a life-changing moment for you. This can be a moment that can change everything for you. And he said, I forgive you. At which stage this young man named Brandon turned and he said, what is wrong with you people? Because he was convinced that we were stalling. But we weren't stalling. We were brought into this young man's life to offer him grace and forgiveness and become a redefining moment. Do you know how that young man ended up at our camp? Because of my church in Northern Ireland, at the induction of our minister, one of my best friends, and certainly my wife's best friend, was murdered right at the door of our church. A terrorist came up behind her, put a gun to her neck, and said, I'm going to shoot you. And she thought it was one of us. She thought it was us having fun. And the gunman shot her, and he ripped through her spine. And lying on her hospital bed, paralyzed from her neck down, Karen said to her mom, imagine what this terrorist's mother must be going through if she knew that her son did this. And Pearl, her mom, began to look at Karen and realized If Karen can have such an attitude and she's paralyzed from the neck down, then what does that mean for me? And 3 weeks later, Karen died. It was a soul-destroying moment in the life of our church and amongst our youth group. But Pearl McKeown took on the challenge of going and meeting them with the terrorist factions. She met them with the now famous Jerry Adams. And Jerry Adams was so moved by Karen's story, he asked that he could keep Karen's Bible, and he sent it back to Pearl a number of weeks later through a Catholic priest. But Pearl stood famously at the Ulster Hall in Belfast and held hands between a Protestant terrorist and a terrorist coming from the Catholic community, and she said these words, "God has made me an instrument of peace." One day when I was sitting at camp, just silently working on a talking about forgiveness, I'd picked up the story that Chuck Colson talks about in the book, and he tells the story of my friend Karen. And I was reading it, and I don't know how things work, but the phone went. And it was a friend who doesn't usually call me, so I picked up the phone, and I said, "Hey, Mike, everything okay?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm just traveling in the car with the executive director of Prison Fellowship. John, do you take any kids through an angel tree program at Muskoka Woods?" And I said, "No." He says, "We've got a ton of kids that don't have a camp, and as you'll find it pretty quick for me, all problems are solved by me by sending kids to camp. That's my answer to everything. You got a problem, send them to camp. You got a problem, send them to camp." And I said, "Yes, we'll take them." And through that story, Brandon ended up at Muskoka Woods. And I firmly believe for the first time in his life, he experienced staff who looked at their world and said, "It doesn't have to be this way." And they did something about it. So the first thing is see. The second thing is stretch. Now, when I first took over Muskoka Woods, my father-in-law asked me to come to his office. And I showed up in his office, and it was a very intimidating office. In fact, if you saw the office we're in today, you would think that we're crazy. It's one of the biggest mansions. It is stone that came in from Winnipeg, and Mr. Boddy built his office so that when people saw the office, they would say, "If that's what his office is like, I wonder what his homes are like." And Mr. Boddy's reputation as a home builder was through the roof, to use a pun, Steve. And it was amazing that I went down into his office, and this was my first time sort of reporting to him, and I came into his office, and he brought me around the side of his desk, and he showed me a picture. And it was a picture of the cavalry, and they were on horses, and they were charging into battle. And he turned to me, and he said, "John," he goes, "what's that painting of?" And I looked up above his desk on his wall, and I said, "I think that's the charge of the Light Brigade." And he said, "That's right." Now, I found out later it was the charge of the Royal Scots. Any of you who are Scottish, during part of the Battle of Waterloo. And he looked, and I'm looking at the picture of these men charging into battle, and then my father-in-law turns to me and says, "Which one do you want to be?" And I turned and looked, and you could tell these men were right on the front line, and I imagined myself somewhere at the back, you know, maybe in the mess tent or something. And I said, "Oh, Mr. Boddy," even though I was married to his daughter, I called him Mr. Boddy, remember? Heels together. I was like, "Mr. Boddy, I just don't know." And he goes, "I want to be that one at the front." And then he turned to me and right on my face goes, "Charging into battle!" This was my first day on the job. Mr. Boddy was an incredible man. A man who, in a sense, really was a take charge kind of person, but what he did to us young people was incredible. He took ordinary young people, 20-year-olds, 22-year-olds, me, 24-year-olds, and said to us, "I believe in you." In fact, at Mr. Boddy's funeral, we asked people to write letters to Mrs. Boddy that would just talk about his life. And hands down, the distinctive part of his life was this. One young person wrote, "I just started at Muskoka Woods. I was a 19-year-old water ski instructor. I was down by the boats. And this elderly gentleman came up to me and said, 'What's your name and what do you do?' And he said, 'Well, I'm a water ski instructor.' And he said, 'Well, come with me.' And this young 19-year-old said, this man he didn't know and suddenly find out was Mr. Boddy, the camp owner, took him with him and said, 'I want to show you something and I want to get your opinion.' And this young person, now in business, shares the story of how Mr. Boddy genuinely listened. And my friend best characterized, if you listened and hung around Mr. Boddy, even as a young person, 20 years old, you walked away with this sense of feeling he deeply respected your opinion. He treated you like you were a much respected superior and a rich storehouse of wisdom. This is young people. But what Mr. Body did more than that was, he was a man who took the moment to actually help you stretch and imagine what you could be. I rode one day when I was a section head, long before I married his daughter, on a motorcycle right into the middle of the dining room in front of all these children. We had wigs on and we had rock stuff on, and I don't like to admit this, but we had cigarettes in our mouth. They weren't lit. We're smarter than that. And as we're riding in on the motorcycle, we're trying to get the kids to react and cheer and stuff, and they've got these cards where they're going to vote on how good our entrance was. And we ride the motorcycle, and as we ride through the door, imagine in the middle of a dining room, a full motorcycle coming in at pretty good speed through the door, and suddenly I look up, and across on the far side of the dining room, I could see Mr. Body standing there, and I turned to Grant and I said, "Spit your cigarette, there's Mr. Body." And as we're riding in, I'm on the back, we spit our cigarettes as we go through the door, and we ride the motorcycles right in, and all I can think of is, we're getting fired. Oil is spraying out on his carpet, we jump off, kids are cheering, and then I'm looking, I can see Mr. Body just looking at me, covered in this wig and whatever else, and he calls me over, and I'm thinking, oh, we're dead. I walked over to Mr. Body, and he said, "John, that's just fantastic. The kids loved that." And then he turned and said these words to me, "I believe God has sent you to Muskoka Woods, and you're one of the spiritual pillars of this place." I thought I was going to get fired. Instead, I got stretched. See, Mr. Body could look at wild, crazy young people, totally different from himself. By this stage, he was well into his late 60s, and he looked at his world and said, "You know what? It doesn't have to be this way. These young people are making a difference," and he cheered us on. But more than that, Mr. Body so listened to our opinion that it's become part of our culture today, that we switched calling children campers. Because back in the old days, it used to be some of you went to camp, the pesky campers, the little brats and all that stuff. And we so were moved by Mr. Body, the way he treated us, we decided to call the children guests. Because of the way Mr. Body treated us, we decided to treat a 7-year-old like they were a guest. And we began to work with people. And I don't want to bring up a lot of pain for you folks. I'm sure there's some Canadians here, but at the Olympics a few weeks ago, sorry, you knew it was coming. Sorry, Steve. But I don't know if you know, but Canada won gold in hockey and curling. We're very proud. But there's this great commercial that came on TV. And one of the young Canadian players, I always say his name wrong, Jonathan Tay, this outstanding young player, and on this commercial, run by one of the companies that was sponsoring the Olympics, it started off with just him. And then slowly the camera began to back away, and it said these words, "Jonathan Tay scores a goal, assisted by the early rising parents, the backyard rink builders, the tireless fundraisers, the coach and trainers, the pre-game meal makers, the kindly business sponsors, the trusty car pullers, the play-by-play announcers, the crowd igniters, the statisticians, the organ player, inspirational sign makers, grandparents, scouts, scape sharpeners, and foam finger fanatics, and everyone else who proves there's no such thing as an unassisted goal." I started off this talk by telling you that Muskoka Woods is a place where young people said, when I'm there, I change, I become a leader because people see me, they stretch me, they support me. And I want to tell you, friends, if in this room, if on this video you're listening, all you have to do is come up beside a young person and say what you really see in them. Stretch their imagination as to what they really can accomplish, just like Mary mentioned in his introduction, and then support them through thick and thin, through the ups and downs. And friends, we may raise up the future President of the United States. We may raise up the future Prime Minister of Canada.